Hey, this is Dominic, and this is your home for the cutting-edge conversations on optimizing your personal performance, lighting up your sex life, and living a purpose-driven life of your own design.
These are the topics that Dominic and I have both struggled with in our own lives and still don't always get right. This is Brian. Welcome to the Great Man Podcast.
When you think of the epitome of the toughest guys in the world, you'd be hard-pressed to find a more indestructible collection of men than the Navy SEALs. Now, the SEALs are widely believed to be the most elite special forces unit in the world, and for good reason. When a class of 200 of our country's strongest and physically gifted men are whittled down to just 10 SEALs, as was the case in our guest's journey, and when you have to endure 5 consecutive days of sleep deprivation while undergoing nonstop inhumane physical challenges that are designed literally to break you, and yet you somehow still survive, then, my friends, you have earned your seat at the table as the world's toughest of men. So it might surprise you to learn that our guest today, a Navy SEAL, has built his entire leadership methodology on the back of the one thing that most men have been taught is our ultimate Achilles heel: emotions. Now, as you guys know, Brian and I are huge proponents of men learning emotional fluency. And emotional fluency we define as the ability to feel an emotion, to name that emotion, to be with that emotion and not be reactive to it, to express the emotion, like to articulate what's going on, and then the ability to shift that emotion if desired, right? And to take empowered action from that place. Now, a leader who has mastered these key components of emotional fluency is level-headed in crisis situations and trustworthy when the heat is on, and oftentimes thrives when the pressure is at the highest. So our guest today, Errol Doebler, is here to teach you his 5 steps of how to master your emotions in leadership settings that range from the combat field to the boardroom to your kitchen table. So who is Errol Doebler? Errol is a Navy SEAL and former FBI special agent, and he was honored with the FBI Shield of Bravery back in 2010. Today, Errol is the CEO of a leadership training consultancy named Leader 193, and that's named after his SEAL team, I think, Hell Week class that he talks about in the show today, where he now provides individual and group coaching along with corporate workshops and keynote speeches. He's also a certified trainer in the Wim Hof method and is currently doing 365 consecutive days of ice baths at 36.5 degrees Fahrenheit. For those of you who are on the metric system, that's just a few degrees above freezing. Also the author of a book called The Process, Art, and Science of Leadership: How Leaders Inspire Confidence and Clarity in Combat, in the Boardroom, and in the Kitchen. And I've got to give a shout out to my boy, Robert Vaughn, who's also a member of the Great Man Digital Mastermind, who brought Errol to the show. He's also the one who brought Eric Maddox, the interrogator who caught Saddam Hussein, also to the show as well. Robert, you're bringing dynamite interviews. Thank you, my brother. In this episode today, we're going to be talking about Errol's 5-step process for leading in the boardroom, on the combat field, or at the kitchen table. He takes us back to his Navy SEAL Hell Week and talks about how he used this emotional awareness that he talks about in leadership settings to befriend his fear that nearly crippled him versus suppressing that fear, or trying to battle that fear, or deny it, or succumb to it, and ultimately conquered the training as a result of learning how to embrace his fear. He talks about how great leaders create predictability in the emotional environments in which their teams operate. This is a massive insight, guys. And then we also talk about how to become aware of our emotions. And by doing so, becoming aware of our own emotions, it gives us that Jedi-like insight into how the emotions of others are driving their behaviors. And of course, Errol has some pretty cool stories of his time in combat and all the different situations that life has thrown at him along the way. So please enjoy today's episode of How a Navy SEAL Embraces Emotional Fluency in Leadership Situations, featuring Errol Doebler. So Errol, this is a really special occasion for us because for the last year, Brian and I, as a matter of ritual to drop in with our guests, we lead our guests through Wim Hof breath. to get ourselves activated and ready to go together. This was our very first time being led by a certified Wim Hof instructor. So it feels really cool. The advanced technique that you took us through with the squeeze and the intensity of breathing, like totally activated me and dropped me in. So thank you for that. And we just want to welcome you to the show because this is our very first time having a Navy SEAL on the show. And this is really exciting because we are coming off of the heels of doing a 31-day mentally tougher man challenge, where a group of 350 guys every single day in the month of January got an email, a text around a challenge regarding meditation, sometimes breath work, other times cold showers, these types of things. I think a great place to start, Errol, would just to be maybe introduce yourself to our audience. Who are you now? What are you doing now? And then what were the paths that led you here, obviously with your SEAL background and your FBI background as well?
Yeah, right. So right now, I run a leadership consulting firm. It's my leadership consulting firm. It's called Leader 193. 193 is just my Navy SEAL Hell Week training class. So it kind of pays homage to that. I run the business with my wife, who I met in the FBI when we were both in the FBI. We are starting our expansion. We're hiring coaches. It's everything I hoped it would be. I went to the United States Naval Academy, where leadership is part of the curriculum. Literally. And that's, if you're not familiar with it, once you graduate, it's an academic institution, but it also is an officer breeding ground. So you're required to spend 5 years in the service after you graduate from the Naval Academy. So I spent 8 years in the Navy. Most of that time was as a Navy SEAL at SEAL Teams 4 and SEAL Team 1. But before that, I was actually what's called a surface warfare officer. I was a ship driver because I couldn't get that Navy SEAL billet right out of college. So I had to do my time on a ship, perform, request a lateral transfer, and then go to the SEAL teams. Now, the SEAL teams, I wanted to stay in forever. I loved it, right? I loved everything about it. There wasn't one thing, and it wasn't even, it was before the war, right? So actual war work was hard to come by at that time. But as it turns out, when I was on deployment, we got tasked with the ship takedown. We did our rehearsal the day before, and I got injured and subsequently medically discharged from the Navy. So I spent the next few years in the private sector, kind of licking my wounds, which I enjoyed immensely until one day I was at a sales call in New York City, September 11th, 2001. And, Brian, like we talked about a little bit, in some way, shape, or form, everybody changed that day. And especially if you were there, and I lost my brother-in-law that day, that led me to the FBI. I loved being a special agent for the FBI. I worked counterterrorism operations. I investigated terrorists and terrorist organizations all around the world. I was also a member of the New York SWAT team, which I loved doing, right? I got that medical clearance before my wounds had healed at that point. But then I also, while some of the best leaders I ever met and saw were in the FBI, in my estimation, they were outliers. And I had some personal issues with FBI leadership and some of the cultural things. And so I just said, it's time to take maybe my experience. And if leadership means that much to me, maybe I can help people become better leaders. So I just said, all right, I'm going to go. I went and started my own thing. And then now my career culminates with being on the Great Man Within podcast. That's it. It's all, I can end it all in the next hour and a half.
You've hit the mountain peak. That's awesome.
It's as good as it gets.
As you know, one of Brian's biggest dreams was to work for the FBI. It didn't materialize, but we saw that you in 2010 were awarded the FBI Shield of Bravery for performing classified duties. Brian and I want to know, what the hell were those classified duties that you performed?
I get those questions all the time, right? Because people are like, well, I know you can't talk about it, but, and my response is, I will answer any question you have. You'll never know what I'm not talking about. There's always a framework that I can have a fun discussion around. So, everybody thinks I just spill the beans, but, obviously I'm not telling you the things I can't tell you, but I was awarded the Shield of Bravery, which I was very proud of. And I don't think I deserved it. Just let me be perfectly clear on that, because if I got it, then everybody in the world should have a Shield of Bravery. But I digress. I was attached to the 75th Ranger Regiment in 2010 as an FBI special agent. At the time, our special operations forces were doing a really good job of smashing targets, right? They were doing great. The SEAL teams, Delta, Green Berets, the Rangers. What they were struggling with was how to get information. And so like every good organization, and our special operations forces, I believe, are the best, they made an adjustment. They said, who's good at talking to people in stressful situations, getting them to talk about things they don't want to talk about, and getting actionable intelligence fast? Well, FBI agents are pretty good at that. So what they did was they found people like me who they knew could handle themselves on the battlefield and had that experience. And I had a lot of experience interviewing terrorists and all that stuff around the world. So we were attached to those special operations forces to, once the target was secured, they would, at least in my experience, the Ranger squad I was with, they turned the target over to me and the couple of guys I was with and say, okay, the target's yours. You have 10 minutes before we need to get out of here. Find the bad guy and tell us who we're taking with us. Okay. And sometimes we would have an hour, but inside of those duties, at some point, we saw a lot of combat. At some point, somebody said, me and the couple of guys I was with deserved that award. It seemed pretty standard what we were doing, but they gave it to us and I was appreciative.
Yeah, I think the standard for a shipman, a Navy SEAL, and an FBI agent is I think your standard might be slightly different.
Well, maybe yes, maybe no. But, again, from the combat side, yeah. But that's why I talk about my combat stuff. And combat, by the way, in my mind, is anytime you're in a situation, if you do things incorrectly from a leadership perspective, from a behavioral perspective, you have the chance of getting hurt, injured, or killed, or mission failure. So I considered certainly the SWAT operations we did in the FBI combat, but I also considered going out on surveillance in a bad neighborhood, right? People get killed on surveillance because they're not doing things properly. Going and knocking on a door to do an interview of somebody that's got a history of some violence, right? In my mind, that's combat. You better be ready, for all these things. So I use those examples to highlight, to your point, Brian, that yes, they are in your face examples. Combat, the ultimate expression of consequence. If you do things wrong, mission failure, injury, or death. But the things you do to prepare for them are applicable everywhere. It's the same stuff. There's not a secret magic box that, this is the combat leadership. No, it's all the same stuff. Bring it home, bring it to work, bring it to your social circle.
Errol, let's talk about that. First of all, Dominic, is there anything more manly than Errol's background? I don't think it's possible. It's literally the most manly thing. And Errol, something that we talked about before we hit record is what you're teaching now in that leadership. So you said this leadership thing that you learned is not just combat, but it's leadership overall. And something we talked about was emotions and emotional, I don't know if you call it intelligence, but I'm wondering, how does a guy that's gone through the most manly backgrounds in combat ready start talking about emotions and leadership?
And actually, I'm fascinated by that question. I think that would provide like a real context for that is take us to Hell Week. Because Hell Week is a thing that one of the things that I'm so fascinated by. I mean, you're talking about going to the depths of your mental and emotional, like absolute limits. And the toughest guys in the world, the most capable, physically gifted guys in the world don't finish, right? Like get broken and tap out, ring the bell. And only a third of the people who start Hell Week finish it.
That's right.
So I would just love to know, from an emotional and mental capacity, spiritual capacity, walk us through your experience, Errol, and then what you learned about that there. And I think that will help inform what you teach about now in leadership capacity around emotions.
Yeah. So let me go sequentially on that because, Brian, your question is important. And then Dominic, when I dive into Hell Week, you said, what do we call it? Emotional intelligence. I developed a leadership process, right? There's 5 elements to it that I believe these elements are applicable everywhere in life. If you have anything that's going wrong, you're going to find the answer inside of one of these elements. Okay. And I never knew when I put this process together, when I left the FBI and said, okay, I'm going to start this leadership consulting thing. What do I believe? Damn. Right. So you have to really articulate, you kind of know in your core, but if I'm going to teach this to people, it needs to be super clear. And the ability to recognize emotions, because emotions drive actions, was the first thing that came to my mind. I'm like, that's what people are missing. I know they are. I never even knew that there was this thing called emotional intelligence, that there was books out there that people were making a living on. Now I was gratified after I'd put it together, and I'm like, oh, this is a whole thing out there, right? It's a whole thing. So on the one hand, I'm like, oh, I guess I'm not as smart as I thought. On the other hand, I was like, I did my thing in a bubble, And it is something that people are struggling out there. So that's good. That made me feel good that I was on the right track. That's the first thing. It was the most easy thing to come up with as far as how do you begin your leadership process? Because everything starts with an emotion. You have an experience, you have an emotion, and then that emotion will drive an action. That action could be inaction. I'm frozen because my emotion is fear. That's still applicable. And then we follow it on from there. Now, ironically, so much of what I now teach, and I can use examples, right? Because everything, my method is 100% organic to me and my experiences. There's not one thing that's theoretical. Here's the things that I'm trying to, have you buy into, and here's why. Here's what happened to me. However, if you go back to Hell Week, I was 25 years old, right? And I was considered old, 25, 26, whatever I was, right? I was considered one of the old guys. And we know at that age, especially as a young man, you really should still have diapers on, right? Your capacity to make logical and good decisions is so flawed. So the knowledge of my emotions wasn't honed yet. However, as I reflect back, I realized that everything I was doing was based on a knowledge of my emotion. So as we go back to Hell Week, I'll start you right from the beginning.
Really quick, I think you hit something that's really important because I find myself doing this often, which is in the moment when you were 25, 26 years old, you didn't know that emotions were driving your behaviors. Right?
That's right.
But upon reflection, you're like, oh, interesting. That was fear. That was the action I take. That was happiness. That's the action I take. Okay, cool.
Right. And the reason is that because I was so, look, I opened my book with all my failures, and I do that for a lot of reasons, right? People read that first chapter and they're like, Jesus, Errol, like that really took some guts. And I did it twofold. First thing is I wanted to let people know I believe in what I'm trying to sell you, but I don't want for 1 second to come across like I'm at a higher plane. Okay. I want you to know right out of the gate, here it is. The other reason is, and I was listening to one of your podcasts, and it was around criticism, right? And how do we handle criticism? And you guys did a whole thing on that. And there was really a lot of that was also involved in me. And you used the term opening the kimono, because I have a personality that can tend to have people want to criticize me, right? For whatever reason that is. We get into it, and I've become very adept at it. I get it. I understand it. It no longer really bothers me too much. But what I wanted to do was I wanted to come out of the gate and warding off all the trolls right out of the gate. I didn't want anybody to be able to come back to me or come back publicly and say, yeah, he's telling you all the good things. Let me tell you what's behind the curtain with Errol. I want to just get it out there because now my nemesis are looking at that going, well, he already said it. Right? So what am I going to say? So anyway.
It's like that scene from that movie 8 Mile with Eminem at the very end where he's battling the other guy. He just like goes up first and he's like, here's all the shit that you're about to say to me. So I'm just going to diffuse that first.
Yeah.
And then the other guy comes on stage. He's got nothing to say. And Eminem drops the mic, wins the championship.
Yeah, there you go. So anyway, I digress a little bit, but so that awareness of the emotions and it was so important to me because I made so many mistakes as a young man, despite a very fancy resume, digging deep inside of you, like, how did I get through some of these things? And upon reflection, it's like, why would things be going so well? And then all of a sudden I'd kind of do this self-sabotage thing, right? Why couldn't I just be consistent? And it was all based on emotion. And now I see that. So I can talk now very clearly about Hell Week and the role of emotions. And I'll start with, right? So I was an officer. I was in charge of that class. And they're very hard on officers at Navy SEAL training, right? If something goes wrong, doesn't matter what it is, they'll find me and say, why did that go wrong, right? That's your job as a leader. And then along the lines, everybody in there is going to be held to that same standard. But so I was going out, and the thing about Hell Week is you can't really prepare for it. You just simply can't. From the standpoint of, so Hell Week is 5 days long, right? Sunday night to Friday afternoon. And they told us we got about 2.5 hours of sleep during Hell Week, not per night, the whole thing. Okay. And knowing that, and this is before the internet, everybody can look and see what SEALs do now. That wasn't what it was. So you knew there was this thing called Hell Week, and you knew you were awake a lot. And my biggest fear was what happens if I do something in a semi-state of delirium because I've been sleep deprived and I wake up Wednesday morning in a nice warm bed with a hot cup of cocoa next to me. And I'm like, what happened? Right? That was my big fear, the fear of the unknown. And you cannot practice sleep deprivation. You can't. I could say to you, Dominic, stay up for 72 straight hours. I guarantee you can't do it because there's no motivation behind it, right? You're going to fall asleep. Whereas at Hell Week, you're not stopping. You're never really stopping. So you're staying awake. And they've got the formula right. Like about this point is when you'll start getting delirious. You'll start seeing things. And now it becomes dangerous. And they'll give you your first nugget of sleep. So they've got the formula. But that was my biggest fear. So I'm sitting out there in my room before we class up, everybody meets to start. And I'm afraid, right? And I knew then, I'm like, I'm afraid, and this is bad. I cannot be afraid going into this thing because that's the wrong state of mind to be in. I can respect it, but this fear I'm feeling is wrong. And I was like, this is concerning me. Now I'm piling on the concern, right? And I'm literally about to step out of my room and do at that time the most important thing in my life. So I said, okay, slow down, right? Slow down. What's your job? Your job is to lead these guys. And if you're afraid, somebody else is afraid. And I just kind of started walking through my emotion, right? Not denying it, like, no, F that. I'm not afraid. I'm going to go crush it. I was like, okay, let's accept this fear. Let me break it down as best I can. And I did. And I said, okay, I'm afraid for this thing. What's my job? My job is to lead. Wait a second. If I'm afraid, I'm pretty normal here. These guys, somebody else is going to be afraid. Yes. And I would say, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do my job because my job is to help these guys get through it, to lead them through it. So if I'm feeling afraid at any moment, I'm going to look around because somebody else is going to be afraid and I'm going to find them and help them. And boom, that was it. So yeah, Hell Week was very difficult, but I didn't have a hard time in Hell Week because all of a sudden that fear, that emotion that would have driven me to awful things, that's how I worked through it. And all of a sudden it was just a hard thing to get through. Okay. But I was able to do things based on my emotion that were very important. The fear never went away, right? Like, oh my God, there's little bouts of it, but every time I had a bout of, can I do this? Let me find somebody else. That's how I decided to act on my fear.
Errol, this is blowing my mind because I've read a lot about SEALs experiences going through Hell Week and it's ungodly torture, sleep deprivation. And then at the moment you're about to break, then you got to go carry, a raft over your head in the water while it's raining and blaring music and all this stuff. And what you just described where you're like, okay, the fear was there. Once I finally got to that, then it just became a difficult experience. And when I hear the word just difficult, the way you described it, it was such a dilution of like all of the terror that I've heard about. So is that really the power of what you uncovered is I feel this fear instead of fighting it or ignoring it, which maybe would have caused it to grow stronger, but by welcoming it, giving it a seat at the table, and then also like leading from that place and bringing other guys into that. Was that the way that you were able to reduce its power and grip over you?
100%. And it's a good example of how is not what I just talked about applicable everywhere. So again, this is why these combat examples are good because it's in your face, right? That example is just completely in your face. But the process is exactly the same. The reason I say difficult experience is because it's what they told us at Bud's training. They're like, just for your information, congratulations, you made it through Hell Week. And my class was a very interesting class. We had 200 people start my class. We graduated Hell Week with 10. Bud's is 6 months wrong. Hell Week is in in the fourth or fifth week, right? So it was like, all it was people quitting, right? It was easy to get caught up in that. But the point I'm making is they were like, look, hey, good job. Congratulations. Be proud of yourself. But guess what? This isn't shit. This is not the hardest thing you'll do. Once you leave Bud's, this is not the hardest thing you do. And I remember thinking to myself, that's impossible. That is impossible what that guy just said. And then the first operation, we went on a training operation even, right? I was like, oh, okay. Yes, he's right. Bud's, you're surviving, right? Hell Week, you're surviving. You're walking around like a zombie idiot. As long as you're not quitting, you're doing okay. Sleep deprive on a real operation, right? Stay up for 48, 72 straight hours. Because by the way, that time that you're awake starts with the planning, right? Then you go right into planning and then the operation, and then there's all the stuff afterwards. So you're awake for days on end, and you don't get to just survive. You have to perform, and then you have to come back and you have to be aware, because you have to explain to higher authority what happened and why you did these things. No option to quit. That's why they put you through these things at Buds. They need to know who's going to quit. You're in the field. You can't quit, right? What do you do? So that's why I caveat it was just a difficult experience. But back to our point, what's different? Everybody who's listening, what can't you do bringing that into your house?
At a young age, Errol, when you're talking about Hell Week, coming to that recognition of, oh, I'm afraid. Okay, who else? I'm going to reach out and ask for help. I think it took me 40 plus years to figure out that I can actually accept being afraid and then call somebody like Dominic and ask for help. Mm-hmm. Going back to your resume, doing these different operations, where else has that served you? Like the recognition of an emotion into action.
A lot of different places. So I'll be able to tell, another couple good stories, but let me just close the loop on this Hell Week thing. Everybody who goes to Bud's training is a stud. And now they've opened it up to women. I don't think any women have given it a go yet, but I promise you, there's going to be a woman who gets through, and she's going to be as much as a stud as everybody else physically. Everybody can do 30 pull-ups, 1 million push-ups, run forever, and swim forever. Nobody quit because it was time to go do physical training, right? Nobody quit and said, oh God, we're going to have to do a bunch of flutter kicks next. Nobody. Here's why people quit. It was dark out, and they were going to make us do a bay swim when the water was 50 degrees. And they're like, I'm not getting in that water. I'm not doing it. They weren't even in the water. They're like, I'm not going in. We have to do this, all the famous SEAL training pictures of us paddling the boats out into the surf and all that stuff. There were guys quitting. They saw the waves. And like, I quit. I'm not going out there. Because they were afraid. They were afraid of the surf, it's not an irrational fear. None of it's an irrational fear. But if you break it down, it's just surf. Everybody does it. They acted on that emotion, right? They were not breaking it down. That's not a fault. But that's just, I think, why people quit. That's why when you hear people say it's a mental thing more than anything else, somebody could just quit and say, fuck this. This is not for me. Yeah, I'm afraid of it, but I don't even care to conquer that fear. It's just not something I'm interested in. Cool. That's good. You've just found that this is not your place. There's nothing wrong with that. So anyway, I just wanted to kind of close the loop on that. People quit for those reasons at Buds. Now, here's the problem. So Errol, why did you make so many mistakes as a young man if you were that aware of your emotions at that young age? Well, the answer is because I cared so deeply about being a SEAL. It's just something that was natural for me to acknowledge, because I said, if I don't acknowledge this, I'm not going to make it. So that desire to be where I was important. It was intuitive in me, okay, at that moment. Things that were less important to me, that intuition was a different behavior based on a different emotion. Insecurity, right? Fear of something else not measuring up, right? All those things, unworthiness. You act differently on those, but those are not things you seem to care about. So now you just act. Okay, so I go on. There was a very specific incident that we talked about. We talked about combat. When I was in the FBI, me and my partner at the time, we were going to interview somebody who we believe had ties to terrorism, right? Or knew somebody who did. And it was just based on we were out in the field, we were talking to other people, and they led us to this person. And we said, let's just go. We're out. Let's go knock on this guy's door before too many people can give him the heads up, whatever it is. And we were in Brooklyn somewhere, and I can't remember where, but it wasn't the best part of the town. And as we're walking up the stairs, it's clear we're in a tough spot. And we're dressed like FBI. My partner at the time was an NYPD detective, but we're dressed up. We've got the suit and tie on. It's not a question who we are. We are law enforcement of some point. And especially me, because we were in a minority neighborhood and I was the only white guy walking around. My partner was Hispanic. So if he had just dressed normally, he would at least fit in a little bit, right? So from a demographic standpoint. So we knock on the door and there's garbage and crap all in the hallway. It's disgusting. The guy comes busting out, right? Somebody called him. And he comes out, so we back up. and he automatically goes to a bottle on the ground, breaks the bottle, and now he's got that. Okay, we haven't even said hello yet. It is that we are in a situation, as I would define it, a set of circumstances dictating a need for action. It's either an opportunity or a problem. We have something going on. Now, there's been a lot of talk recently about police shootings and unjustified shootings. And yes, some of them are. A lot of them are not. The rules of deadly force are very complex, okay? And at the end of the day, if you have somebody who's acting with hostility towards you and you carry a gun, you are in a gunfight. There doesn't need to be two guns to be in a gunfight. There needs to be a gun that anybody can get their hands on, okay? And now all of a sudden, you are in a life and death situation by definition. So when you hear people get shot unarmed or they get shot with a bottle in their hand, oh, that's unfair. We've got to break that down a little bit more. We've painted, and I've been critical of law enforcement, having been a part of it, but that's a criticism that's gone too far in my mind, and I'm kind of getting off topic. So here we are. Boom, bottle. We both go here, right to our weapon. And, we're ready to go. And I said to my partner, I go, hold on. We're okay. I go, just keep it in. And he was like, no. And my point was, so when we talk about emotions, that was a terrifying moment, right? It's not something you're like, oh my God. But what I saw at that time was that guy's fear, the bad guy's fear. I saw where he was. And so that emotional awareness and recognition as part of my process goes both ways. As a leader, we have to start with ourselves. Once we start being aware of our emotions, we're going to be very conscious of somebody else's emotions. And my thought was, that guy's petrified right now. He thinks we're coming here to arrest him. And we weren't, right? We didn't know what his thing was. We were there to talk to him. So in my mind, as you go through, I said, look, to myself, he's going to come at one of us. Okay. The other one will be there to protect us. We're okay. I'm feeling relatively comfortable with his bottle thing. But would we have been justified in shooting that guy? Yes, we would have, because he was making moves towards us. That is a life and death situation. My point is, though, based around the emotions, and I said, let me just try to calm this guy down. Let me just try to calm him down. And I said, man, we're not here to arrest you. I think that's why you think we're here. We're not, right? Right. But then it's, well, what are you here for, motherfucker? The whole thing. And in my mind, I'm like, now we're at least having a conversation. I know that my partner is ready to protect us with deadly force if he needs to. So I'm feeling like I can now be in my own world with this guy, trying to talk to him. And little by little, he calmed down. His emotions were down. And I said, man, can you drop the bottle? I said, you're going to get shot if you don't drop the bottle. It's but then there's a conversation around that. I'm not dropping this bottle, but at least we're talking, right? And as long as my emotions are not escalating to his emotions, we have a chance. And it was diffused. He invited us in. We had a conversation. He was nobody. He was a nobody. So the point is, hopefully it's an exciting story for your audience and you guys listen to, but based around the emotions, right? There was some real justification to use deadly force in that situation. And it was an emotional awareness and recognition that allowed us to back it all down, both me and my partner.
It's such a beautiful story because if you think about, let's contrast how your situation turned out with how it could have turned out. Mm-hmm. If you end up with three people who act from a place of emotion and trigger, and there was one, it was the guy who broke the bottle. Like, he immediately showed up in a situation, he felt an emotion and then broke a bottle. If the two of you were in the same kind of place, that very easily could have ended up with one or multiple people dead.
Yep.
Right?
Absolutely.
And we can look at that in almost any leadership situation where the emotions are running high, whether it's in business or maybe in a family, right? With a father and two emotional kids.
Absolutely. In a family. Take it there,
right? Triggered kid, and then the father gets triggered, and the mother gets triggered, and there's World War III.
That's right. Everybody's doing this.
Everyone's doing this. All it takes, and in this case, all it took was one leader, you, who had emotional intelligence to feel your feeling. And I loved what you said. I wrote this down, which is, once we are aware of our emotions, we become very conscious of others' emotions. So like it's kind of like the matrix appears and you can see behind the external behavior, what's going on behind the curtain. And you can speak to that and diffuse that situation where the bottle comes down, your partner doesn't discharge his weapon on someone, you don't get hurt. And all of a sudden it's like the situation's over. Those are two very different endings to a story that we see it happen the wrong way too many times.
We do. And so, you guys use the term masculine leadership, right? And I want to break that down a little because I want to get your perspective on it. But somebody might be listening and saying, that sounds like masculine leadership, what Errol did. Yeah, based around emotions, recognizing your emotions, right? So I think the cliche would be that's not masculine leadership, but that's all it is. Here's where law enforcement is struggling, right? They need, in my mind, this type of conversation, right? Because it is a it's a fine line because you have to be ready to do battle physically and mentally in those situations. You just have to, okay? And especially those beat cops, I always found that my role, what I did was easy. Because I was a specialist, right? I was an FBI, I was an investigator. I got to pick and choose. I was always the one making the moves, making people react to me. In special operations, right? Same thing. Being a SEAL team, being with the Rangers, we dictated. The regular soldier that's patrolling, like move out and draw fire, I would never do that. The beat cop, just not knowing when it's going to happen, you couldn't pay me enough to do that. Right. So it's kind of the dichotomy is very interesting. People think that I'm this very special guy. And I'm like, no, what I did was easy because we dictated. So think about that beat cop who's just walking around doing his job and boom, he's hit with that. His mindset is I have to come home. Right. I have to protect myself. I have to protect people around me. And force is the natural inclination. OK, so I would love to help our law enforcement just say, look, it's okay to acknowledge the emotions. It's okay to talk about them because the more we talk about them, the more we're going to be aware as soon as they hit us. And the more we're going to be able to take that split second and maybe make a different decision, right? The George Floyd thing. Let's talk about that, right? It's now in a space where it's not so emotionally charged. It's a tragedy, all that. I'm getting it. Here's what went wrong. Nobody said to that guy kneeling on his neck, hey, man, settle down. Let me take it from here. He wasn't going anywhere. He was handcuffed. So an emotional awareness around that could have gone from somebody else, right? From a partner saying, hey, I don't even know the guy's name, whatever the hell his name was. Hey, Bill, why don't I take it from here? He's complaining. Let's get off this a little bit. Let's take our ego and our emotion out of this for a second. That's, it's a prime example.
Errol, where do you start with guys? We're talking about two different things here. One are the rules. Like, what are the rules of engagement? And the other very different side of this equation is let's just call it emotional intelligence or maybe even intuition. Okay, so we have these two very different things. When Me Too happened, Dominic and I are talking to guys constantly and they're confused. Like, I don't know what the new rules are. How do I compliment a woman? These new behaviors. And what we end up coming to in those conversations every single time isn't just a new rule book, but it's a new awareness. And for our guys, we have to tell them, like, look, the reason we do the inner work is so that we can raise our awareness so that we can play with both the rules and our awareness. Where do you start with guys? We can't all do Hell Week, right? We can't all go through buds. How the hell do we increase this awareness or intelligence?
You hit the nail on the head right out of the gate. So I call in my process, it's emotional awareness and recognition. Whatever name you put on it, it's all the same. It's fine. That's what I call it, right? Because I think you have to be aware and recognize. The next part of my process is your culture process. What is your culture? Your culture is made up of the things you do, not the labels you put on, right? Companies, individuals, whatever. So you can say you have a culture of excellence. We have a culture of innovation. We have a culture of trust, whatever it is. I'm not telling you not to say that. But my next question to you is going to be, what are the things that you do to create it? If you can't name me 2 or 3, 4 things, then you're just putting a meaningless label on things. Okay. Now, Those are the first two elements of my leadership process: emotional awareness and recognition, cultural awareness and recognition. Awareness around how we feel and then how we act on those feelings. We have to do it without judgment. It's an ugly drill, because then we realize, wow, now that I'm aware of what I do, I don't really like what I see too much. And now we go to the next phase, behavioral guidelines. We have to decide what behaviors we want based on what we've seen, what we're aware of. Now we start to put meat on the bone. That's why my book is called The Process, Art, and Science. I just brought you through the first three elements of the process. In my mind, you can't deny their importance. Everybody should have emotional awareness and recognition, cultural awareness and recognition, and then create guidelines for behavior based on their awareness. That is the art, process, art, and science. The art is, Dominic, the things you see and the changes you need to make are going to be different than yours, Brian. But let's all agree we have to do those things, and how I maneuver inside of each one of them is going to be a little different. The point I'm making to you is, where do we start? Awareness. Awareness, awareness, awareness. So let's talk about the Me Too movement. Again, a little bit less emotionally charged now. We can talk about it with a little more objectivity. I would say to guys, look, guys, it's out there. Do you tell a dude that he looks really handsome in that tie? Maybe you do, right? If that's kind of your thing. But are we more inclined to tell a woman that she looks very pretty today? Well, if you put it in that context, if you're aware of what you're doing based on some emotion you've got towards that very pretty girl, and now you're acting on it, what's that behavior? So let's just start. Let's break it down. Well, I'm just trying to be polite. That's fair. Is there no other way to be polite than to comment on somebody's physical appearance who you have no intimacy with? I better tell my wife she looks beautiful, right? Because we have an intimate relation. That is part of why we're married, because there's a physical attraction, there's an emotional attraction. And then to tell her, you look beautiful today. I know that's going to make her feel good because that's my job, and she does look beautiful today. But that doesn't apply. That behavior doesn't apply across the board. So with that awareness of what we do based on how, because if I said to somebody, if a man said to me, well, no, it's just polite, I would say, what's the emotion you're feeling behind that? What are you feeling? What drove you? Well, it's just, she looks nice. No bullshit. Stop lying. Let's be honest with ourselves here, okay? It's because you're
this is coming from a trained investigator, by the way. So this
right. Like, stop it, right? We've all been there. It's okay. It's part, we're men, they're women. There is a natural thing. But the point I'm saying is, are you aware of how you are behaving? And then establish whether that behavior works or doesn't. Good for the Me Too movement. I'm for it. Now, look, has it gone too far in some instances? Of course. Welcome to life. What we as men need to do, to your point, Brian, where do we start? That's where we start. Have that conversation with yourself. What am I feeling? How am I acting? That's my culture. And I don't like that culture. How do I want it to be? What is my behavior now? And now you start establishing, if I behave in this way, will I get better at everything? Will I get better? Will I be a better coworker if I recognize that the very pretty girl is walking through the office and I get a little charge and I want to say, wow, you look awesome today, right? Would I be a better coworker if I didn't say that? If I instead complimented that very pretty girl on a substantive piece of work, the very reason that we're in the same place together. Hey, that was an awesome presentation you gave today. Thumbs up. That's appropriate, right? That's an appropriate behavior based on an emotion, right? You know what I'm saying? So again, I maybe I've gone on a little too long. I'll let you guys jump in on.
Well, it sounds like the word here is awareness. And sometimes we can do that with ourselves, but the reason that community is so important, and going back to your story about Hell Week, you realize that other people were feeling the same way, and I imagine maybe you even had a conversation with them. And so something I know that we talk about often is how can we in community raise each other's, and now we're talking about awareness. So just investigating those sort of things, why are we doing what we're doing, can help us.
And you talk about it. And that's why I like, leadership is a big field and it's good. That's why I feel like I do something very unique. I have a process. So when we say, well, what should we talk about today? Well, I've just broken it down for you. If you're not sure what to talk about, let's start with an emotion. Let's start with how we're acting on emotion. Let's start about how we're behaving. So again, how do you do that inside of a group? Something went wrong. I'm struggling with this. Guys, that's the beauty of these groups. That's the beauty of the groups that you guys put on. If I can add to that another arrow in your quiver to help your community, let's break it down. Right? Why do you think you acted that way? What were you feeling when you acted that way? Where else do you act this way? This is probably not a one-off. Okay. Now we're talking about it and we're showing that vulnerability. Let me tell you something, folks. That's a man discussion. Okay. That is a man's discussion, because when we talk about men, we like to talk about courage and things like that. And and I agree, but we've broken it down to physical courage. Oh, Errol, you're a man's man. And I appreciate the compliments. I do. And I'm not belittling. You're a man's man, FBI, SEAL, you combat, blah, 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 because you physically expressed some courage. It takes way more courage for me to say to my wife, I'm sorry I came in and took out my hostility on what happened today on you. I'm sorry. That is the heart. And what gets more frustrating to me is it's like, when am I going to learn? I am so sick and tired of apologizing. Why can't I just get this straight? And then all of a sudden, I become so sick and tired of apologizing to my wife because I've had the courage to do it. Now I start changing my behavior. I'm done. I can't apologize anymore. I have to change my behavior so I don't have to. That's courage.
Yeah, no, right on, Errol. And I'm on the edge of my seat here because I know you have 5 steps of your process, and we got through the first 3 about emotional awareness and recognition. Second step is cultural awareness and recognition, and then the behavioral guidelines that are based on those awarenesses. And I want to get to these next 2 stages of your process, but one of the things that you've said that's really powerful, and I found this in your keynote speaking video, was, leaders create predictability around our physical and emotional environments. Right? Like leaders create predictability around our physical and emotional environments. And what that means to me, right, is if I'm following you as a leader in business or a leader in whatever it is that we're doing, you're my platoon commander. If I know when you're feeling afraid that you're actually going to name that and look for me to be able to express that I'm afraid, and then we're going to get our fucking jobs done in the face of fear. One of my favorite quotes about fear is wetting your pants. And then courage is doing what needs to get done with wet pants. It's just.
Who said that, Brian?
No, Brian just wets his pants.
I take them off and clean them like a normal human does. That's right.
Yeah. And so maybe the way that you can kind of round this out for us is like, what are those 2 final stages of the process that allow you to create that predictability?
There's a million examples around, right? And predictability is, I get a lot of initial pushback on predictability. As a matter of fact, and again, you guys, the thing about criticism, it really struck home with me because a couple of things that happened to me recently. I don't get trolled too often, but once in a while I do. And generally I ignore it. I just don't respond. Recently, I was on somebody's podcast and it was this topic of predictability. And the host of the podcast really liked it. And he put a post on it. And then this troll came in, just bashing predictability. And that's not how you keep people sharp. And he was defending me, the host. And I said, I have to jump in, right? This guy's defending me. Let me lay the law down here a little bit. And what I expressed was, so what? Unpredictability around how people behave is a good thing. Unpredictability around what I'm going to hold you accountable to is a good thing. Unpredictability about how we accomplish tasks is a good thing. Like, leaders create predictability where we can create predictability. Here's how we react to predictability in a very predictable manner. We recognize the emotion, right? We recognize how we are tempted to act on that, but then we go back to our established behavioral guidelines and then we make a plan. Okay. And that's the next step, because I'm talking about a lot of awareness and a lot of, let me do some good self-reflection. But in the end, leaders achieve results. Okay. That's it. That's what you do. And the only way to achieve a result is to have a plan. So we're in a group meeting, we're in a team meeting, right? And we're at a corporation. It's 2008 and the stock market has crashed, right? You're right. I get in, I'm the leader. And I say, okay, team, our stock just went down 400 points in the last hour. I'm a little afraid and unsure of what's going to happen. I just said it. I just said what everybody else is thinking. And then I say, but remember how we do business around here. We don't drive. We don't act based on our emotions. Okay. So let's be very conscious, first and foremost, on how we're all acting. Let's remember, here's how we do things. Here's how we behave. Because as a leader, you've already established that. And if you haven't, now's the time. So I have just now, by definition, set everybody at ease. I was vulnerable. I said, hey, I'm afraid. I'm not sure what's going to happen. I didn't have to cry. I didn't tell everybody, I'm not sure how I'm going to. There's a fine line, right? There's a certain amount of courage we have to display as leaders and composure, okay? But I wasn't any less vulnerable by saying, yep, I'm a little nervous right now. So emotional awareness and recognition, cultural awareness and recognition. Let's just ensure what we don't do. We don't act on these emotions. We act these ways. We act poised, blah, blah, blah. Now, let's put together a new plan. Let's see what our plan is first. Is it still applicable? And if it's not, let's change it. That goes with right? The planning process is just something I pulled out from the SEAL teams, watered it down and modified it to make it simple, right? The planning process in the military and the SEAL teams is pages and pages and pages long, right? But we don't need that in the regular world. We just need to hit these elements.
Dominic, are you feeling this right now? Like I feel like if I was on the team with Errol, I feel taken care of. Like, I'm like, that's right. That's who we are. He's feeling that way. I'm feeling that way. We have a plan. Okay, we're good. It feels like every great movie speech I've ever heard, usually from a military leader or even a business leader.
Because it's a process though, right? Because it's not, I just walked you through the process and that's it. We can't go right to the plan because we might be doing the wrong plan. We might be planning based on an emotion and now we're in the wrong direction. That's why it's a process. I didn't just throw in the term process because it was cool, because that wasn't in some other leadership book. Trust me, when you're naming your book, you got to look at those things, right? You know, right? On purpose leadership, you had to look and say, okay, how many other people have that? But the point is, if you're skipping steps in process, you get an inconclusive outcome. You get a random outcome. You go through what I just said, that's the process. That's why now when we say, if it didn't go right, I can now go back and say, all right, where in my process did I do something wrong or did I miss? Right. So let's just say we use that thing. I give that speech and all of a sudden the company goes out of business. And I as a leader go, oh, let me go back through my process. What did I do? You know what I did? I skipped reminding people what the behavior I expect of them is. That's what I skipped. I forgot to remind them. I acknowledged emotions and I said, let's be careful about how we react to those emotions. But what I didn't say was, here's how I expect us to behave. And I'll hold you accountable to that. And then we just started planning. So we were planning based on the emotion. Damn, you're just going back. This is where you went wrong. You could have fixed that. Maybe you can still go back and fix it. You could certainly fix it going forward. So the planning process and then elements inside the planning process, right? You know, how to use that as a tool. That's too much to get into right now. That'll put your folks to sleep. Maybe it won't. I don't know. But, you know.
But step 4 is the planning process.
Planning process. That's right. And all the ways we use it as a tool to literally just accomplish a mission, but also as a leader, how to ask questions and what to ask questions around.
Yeah. And most people go right to the planning process before these first 3 steps,
Absolutely.
right? And like you said, and then we don't know what behaviors we expect of people. We don't know if it's in alignment with our culture. We don't know if it's emotion, we don't know what our emotions are driving it, which is why I write about this in the On Purpose Leadership book. The textbook case study for handling a nightmare situation came with Tylenol back in what was it, the 70s or 80s when some crazy person was putting cyanide pills in Tylenol bottles, right? People were dying. And the leadership team there sat down and said, how do we protect the people? Number 1. And then how do we protect this brand? Number 2. That came as a result of the 3 steps that you're talking about is they had this emotional awareness that they were in a panic mode, but the people were dying and they needed to preserve their brand. They did have a set of behavior, they knew their culture and their behavioral guidelines, which allowed them to execute on a plan that did cost them millions of dollars in the short term by recalling all of the Tylenol bottles, but their brand exploded as a result of trust. And then they ended up, I think, blowing out the other 4 or 5 competitors as a result of that.
It's a great example. And I forgot all about that. And if you think about it, right, how can a brand survive when people were taking it and they were dying, getting poisoned?
Yeah. And
you're right. Gosh darn, I'm going to go back and look at, I remember when it happened, I was just a kid. But yeah, what they had to have done They had to all recognize, this is bad. And we feel terrible. We're killing people, right? There's an emotion about that. But okay, let's establish that emotion. But that has nothing to do with what we're going to do going forward. What are we going to do? What does our culture? Our culture says we find problems, we fix problems, and we don't act emotionally. And I'm sure they talked about recalling everything. They were probably like, well, is it happening in one region? Maybe we need to look at that. And again, the emotional thing is to say, let's just recall everything. I say that that's only a bad decision if you haven't gone through the process, because you're just making that decision. You may still have the same decision to recall everything, but as long as you've gone through, is that the right thing to do? Does it make sense? Because there's a lot of things involved in this. So yeah, and then they told everybody, here's our plan. Here's what we're doing. And now you either trust us or you don't. Yeah, to perfection, clearly, yeah.
They teach it as case studies in business schools on crisis management. It's like the number one. So with all that said, I mean, we're at step number 4 here, the planning process. What's step number 5?
Yeah, so process, art, and science of leadership. The process is the process. We've just described. Let's all agree that you need to establish emotional awareness and recognition. Let's all agree that you need to establish a planning process, right? Let's all agree on that. How you work that is going to be your thing. You're going to do it within your personality, within the needs, blah, blah, blah. So I got really, as I was writing the book, I got really into Joe Dispenza, right? I love him. I'm a disciple. And how the brain works and the behavioral change. I was just interested in it. So I was reading his books. I was watching his series Rewired on Gaia. I was just soaking it in. And I started as I was paying attention, I'm like, holy crap. My leadership process follows the elements, at least according to Joe Dispenza, that the brain goes through to rewire itself. I was like, I was so excited, right? Because it's based on an awareness of an emotion. Once you are aware of your emotion and what you do, because we get wired, our brain wires itself based on what we do and how we feel. I feel this thing. There's literally a chemical reaction that goes through our body. There's a neurochemical, there's a mind-body connection. We become neurochemically addicted to that emotion. And then we just start finding any reason in the world to act a certain way based on that emotion. Emotional awareness, right? And on it goes. And then we continue to act that way. That becomes our culture. That's our behaviors, right? And so on and so forth. How do we stop it? Well, apparently, scientifically, by first being aware of the very emotion that you're acting on. The second that you're aware of it, your brain already starts to change its chemistry. And then when you're aware of the very nature of the behavior that's being driven by that emotion, you get new chemical reactions because there's a new emotion to that. There's either excitement or disappointment or whatever it is, you are starting to change your physiology. And then we start to make a decision. Wow, now I'm aware because I, for some reason, have this anger. And that's a whole different set of discussions, why you have it. It's almost irrelevant to our conversation right now, not in life, but to our conversation. You say, now, how do I want to behave? And according to the science, your brain starts to change even more. You're now making decisions, at least in your mind, like I want to make some changes. And then what do? Then you make a plan. Then you say, okay, I realize that I am angry. And when I'm angry, I interrupt people and I'm rude. So here's now my plan. The situation is this. My mission is this. And then you start acting on that. Now you are truly changing the neurochemical makeup of your body and the rewiring of your brain. It's the process. So I call that last part of the process the resistance. Everybody calls something the resistance, right? So it's not unique. It's just like, I don't know what else to call it. And I think I read it in Pressfield's book, The War of Art, right? He calls it the resistance. I'm like, and I put it in there. And he doesn't have a chokehold on that term. But even in my book, when I put the resistance, I'm like, look, I just stole this term from Pressfield, right? So I'm giving him full credit because I wasn't original enough. But the point I'm making is this process is logical. You just simply can't deny the logic and the ease of it. It makes perfect sense. If you do these things, you're probably going to get better. You're going to be a little bit better leader. Yet why won't people do it, right? Why won't we do it? Why do we know and then just stop? Think people who smoke. Is there anybody out there smoking who doesn't know you are going to die of cancer at some point? Yet, here we go, right? People just do things. So the resistance, in my definition, is twofold. First, understand that people will just not do what's logical. So as you as a leader are putting this stuff in place, don't take it personally. Don't take it personally. It's a natural resistance. You are doing something hard. You're literally trying to rewire people's brains. So just give yourself a break. Give everybody a break. That's the first thing. Give yourself a break. Give yourself a little as a person, as an individual, as you're applying this process, right, to whatever it is, and you fall off. Don't beat yourself up. You don't suck. You don't not care. You're not the worst person in the world. You're trying to do something incredibly different. You're trying to change the neurochemical and physiological makeup of your body. Give yourself a break, for God's sakes. Okay, don't make an excuse, but just give yourself a break. That's the first thing, the resistance. So as long as we understand that, we can exercise a little more patience with ourselves, with our environment. The other thing is, okay, what do you do when you encounter the resistance? You follow the process. You follow the very same process that people are resisting. You recognize an emotion. I hate this. I don't want to do this. Who's that person telling me what to do? You recognize how they're behaving on it. You remind them of the behaviors that we are expecting. And then we make a new plan if we have to. We reiterate it over and over and over again. The consistency in what we're doing is what matters. And that's the resistance. Simple as that. So it's multifaceted, but that's the resistance.
Bingo. And I'm going to just summarize these 5 steps again, which obviously can be found in your book, which we're going to link in the show notes at the end here. But step number 1, emotional awareness and recognition. Step number 2, cultural awareness and recognition. Step number 3 are the behavioral guidelines based on those awarenesses. Step 4, then you get into the planning process. And step 5 is expect to encounter resistance for all the reasons that you just mentioned. That can be all found in your book, The Process, Art, and Science of Leadership. And the subtitle on that is How Leaders Inspire Confidence and Clarity in Combat, both in the boardroom and at the kitchen table, which I like that last part because you gave some examples in your whole life too.
I mean, does it? And again, I put it to you guys and look, if I'm wrong, I'm wrong, but is there anything I'm saying? And I put these intense examples around, but is there anything that we can't apply to ourselves, our family, our group friends?
Everywhere.
I mean, everywhere.
Yeah. Which has been awesome, Errol. And I know that you do a lot of keynote speaking, you do corporate training, you do some individual coaching too, right? You were doing a session right before.
Primarily what I do is the individual and group coaching, right? That's my bread and butter. And I'm proud to say that I did these things virtually before we had to do things virtually. So I was all set up for the whole thing anyway. But yeah, executive coaching, one-on-one coaching, and then team coaching through this process. That's really the bulk of what I do. I love doing the corporate retreats, the in-person stuff. It looks like we're going to start moving back to that a little bit. Hopefully, that's a whole nother topic. But, those are great. Everything I do is based in the process. How I present it to people, I have a wide variety, right? So again, the one-on-one group coaching, the offsites, the keynotes, but you're going to hear pretty similar stuff from me everywhere.
That's awesome. And I'm going to link your website in the show notes. I'm going to link your book in the show notes. So if that anybody who's like really fired up by what they've heard from you, want more, they can read the book. They can also reach out to you for coaching. Is there any other thing that you would want to point our listeners to either follow you or get more information with you?
Yeah, I would. And I appreciate that. So what we're doing now is, because it's what every successful person does, we're putting on some free webinars. And we just had our first one. And, as you well know, you get a little nervous when you put those on, like, I don't know, is anybody going to show up? I was highly encouraged at the turnout and the response. So we're going to do it again. So if you kind of like what you heard here, if you missed the last one, we're going to do another one towards the end of February. And again, it's just a place to get the message out there. And if you like it, then you reach in and say, how can I get more of this? That's the first thing we're doing. And then we didn't even touch Wim Hof method except for the breathing, right? There's so much to talk about there. But, look, my website, leader193.com, it's a pretty good website. We try to keep it simple, but comprehensive of everything we do. And then, for good fun, you follow me on Instagram at leader193.
Like that too in the show notes. And the free webinar, is that something that I can get a link for on your website for the next webinar? Or is that something you're going to have to give me? Yeah. Yeah,
no. Well, it'll be, I think it's already up on the website for the link to that. And I hope you guys jump in, join in, see what it's all about. And what we do in our field is we steal from each other, but in a good way, right? We like, wow, I never thought about that. I could probably apply that to what I'm doing. And in the end, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to help people get better. And you've done that for me, certainly, by listening to your podcast and seeing what you guys do. I'm like, I'm going to do a little bit of that because that's going to help. That's going to put it in my process. And in the end, we're doing our jobs, I think.
Yeah, right on. Errol, thank you so much for your time, for your information, and also for your leadership. We're out here, trying to make a dent in the world too and create stronger, more powerful, more trustworthy masculine leaders. I know they're going to get a lot out of this episode. And also thank you for starting us off with an intense round of Wim Hof breathing. Good, squeezing that perineum, which Joe Dispenza is a huge fan of. Yeah, that did the trick for me.
Yeah, today, if you're not squeezing your perineum, you're just not doing leadership right.
You're missing out.
Step 6, right. Squeeze the perineum.
Squeeze the perineum. There's all sorts of. You're right. You know what? I'm going to add it.
You're going to have to redo your book, an addendum to the book.
That's right.
Errol, thanks for your service, man, and the continued service that you provide to men like this on this group. Thanks, man.
Thanks, gentlemen. Appreciate you having me.
All right, gentlemen, you know what time it is. What is the one action that you are going to implement in your life as a result of this conversation with Errol Doebler, the Navy SEAL who embraces emotional fluency in leadership situations? By taking action, you make sure this is not just one other piece of content that you consume, never to make a meaningful difference in your life. What is the one thing that you are going to commit to? And I know that I personally loved his insight about how real leaders create predictability in the emotional environments in which your team operates. I would want the men in the mastermind, or Callie, who's my chief operating officer in my business as we grow, to know that she and that we as men in the masterminds have emotional certainty, predictability of how we will handle crisis situations or disagreements or arguments or crossroads that we head to that can create a lot of conflict. And if I, as a leader, have developed my behavioral guidelines, have communicated effectively, have been vulnerable and transparent, then there is emotional safety and predictability in those situations. So it's going to cause me to look a little bit more deeply, and I'm going to put pen to paper and journal on that, and then communicate to the men in the mastermind and to Callie. What are you going to be doing? Let's hear it in the Facebook group, the Great Man Within Facebook podcast group. Just go and search that or look in the show notes. And you can click on that link and we'll see you in there.